Hello, gorgeous souls. This is Rochelle, and welcome to the DIY Affiliate Soul Journey. If you are new to my videos, then please click on the subscription button and ding that notification bell so you will be notified of all new content. Thank you to all of you new subscribers, and thank you to all new seekers of this knowledge. With your comments, your subscriptions, and your likes. This is all a form of energy exchange. Also connect with me and tell me what stage of the awakening that you are at yourself. And if you have any types of tips that you would like to give to the new people who are just awakening to this new earth. Not sure what awakening is? Well, I created a video just for you. It is the 6 stages of awakening in the age of Aquarius. You can find it at the top right-hand corner of this video. First of all, a little bit of housekeeping. Have you been wondering if your thoughts carry frequency? Or have you thought of frequency in music and how does it affect us as human beings? Our thoughts and feelings all carry a frequency. They have a frequency of their own. Just like light, radio, ultraviolet waves. A thought vibrates through the mind. And whether we are aware of it or not, we are manifesting by what we are thinking. Manifesting into our reality by what we are thinking. One unique note can change everything. If you are suffering from stress, anxiety, muscle pains, or lack of sleep, sounds can have an intense effect on our bodies and our minds. Different frequencies can create different mind states, and some can even cure the body. When it comes to healing frequencies, 174 Hertz is one of the best and the brightest. The human ear can hear a vast variety or scope of frequencies, from the lowest rumbling of thunder to the highest shrill tweet of any songbird. Each sound produces a unique vibration that travels through the air
and into our eardrums.
The ancient Sanskrit and medieval Gregorian chants also used solfeggio frequencies for enhanced spiritual experience. The solfeggio tones are believed to have a special relationship with the chakras, the energy centers of our body. When these tones are played together, they create a powerful healing vibration that can help us balance and align the chakras and develop a meditative mind. The 174 Hertz, which is a solfeggio frequency music, this healing frequency is the lowest that is recognized from the ancient solfeggio frequencies. And this is also known as a healing frequency. And this is what I have playing in the background. When you download this app, in which I will leave the link in the description, it's just called Ancient Solfeggio Tones and Frequencies, you will be able to get this frequency, which is 174 Hertz. You can play it with music. You can play it with Om. You can add a bowl sound. You can listen to the frequency by itself without the music. And you can also do something that's called Pranayama, breathing. For meditation, you would inhale once, retain, inhale, exhale 2. For body, you would inhale 1, Retain 1. Exhale 2. For anti-stress and anxiety, you would inhale 2. Retain 1 second. Exhale 1. This is just an example of some of this different style of breathing that you can use for your meditation, for your body energy, or anti-stress and anxiety. The 174 Hertz has the greatest impact on the body when it comes to physical health. Now, I am not talking about your spiritual health at this point or your mental health at this point, but people will mainly experience pain relief from this frequency. And it also reduces stress. Low frequency relaxes muscle that reduces stress, and it also acts as a natural analgesic or pain reliever. People who use this frequency report finding relief from back pain, migraine, knee pain, and more. Now, there are other Solfeggio tones and frequencies in which give you many different benefits, such as 285 Hertz, helpful for wound healing and tissue regeneration. 396 Hertz, helpful to release feelings of guilt, fear, and worry. It will help you to promote emotional healing. 417 Hertz helps to remove negative energy from your environment, and it's also said to promote change and transformation. 432 Hertz. This frequency is thought to help balance the mind and body, and it is also said to promote relaxation. 528 Hertz. Your body needs this frequency to repair your DNA. This tone can also be, the tone with this frequency can also be used to help reduce stress, anxiety, and pain. 639, this frequency is said to promote love, relationships, and connection. It can also help to heal emotional wounds. The 639, in which I will be doing the next video, or a next video coming up on, is also the heart chakra. 741 Hertz can cleanse your body and mind, and also to promote spiritual awakenings. So this frequency I will also be doing a video on. I just wanted to start with the lowest frequency first and then work my way up to the highest, for people who are not familiar with the ancient slow tones and frequencies, to get to know what they are and how they can help you in your life. You can also use the Solfeggio frequencies with binaural beats during a bath or meditation. Binaural beats are 2 different tones played in each ear, which tricks the brain into believing that it is hearing a third blended tone. This blended tone then encourages the brain to enter a meditative state. And you would use the binaural beats with earbuds. That I've given you a little bit of information about the 174 Hertz. I'd like you to now enjoy the rest of the video as I am using the liquid paint.
Fluid Stimulation App.
Leave the link in the video description for you to download. Enjoy. Thank you for watching this video. I hope that you have found it helpful. This is just the beginning of your journey. If you haven't started to go through your awakening yet, then I hope something that I say or do in my videos will help you to awaken without having to face the tower. And if you are not familiar with the 6 stages of awakening, one of the stages is awakening with the chaos, which I call the tower. And if you'd like to watch the first video that I made, which is the 6 steps of awakening in the age of an Aquarius, as well as a little bit of the first chapter of the audiobook by Dolores, which talks about the 3 waves of volunteers in the New World, which is now. Thank you again. I look forward to hanging out with you in the next video. Have a wonderful day.